counting down the seconds. All right. Okay, welcome. It's awesome to see how all these sessions really are frequented by enough people. So it seems to be those session topics that we picked now have pretty much met what you were looking for. This is a live coding session. What I would like you to do is basically just lean back and try to get basic ideas. You don't have to really remember all the code, because at the end you get a link with all the code, so you can just copy it. And I would like to take attributes and introduce to you the different kind of things that you can do with it. It depends on what you want to do, whether you want to use the predefined attributes that PowerShell ships with, or whether you would like to create your own and see what you can do with those. Basically, my presentation has only one slide. It's basically this. We're coding. And I'm going to just always in groups download a couple of scripts. This is my agenda. I would like to first introduce attributes, what they are and where you can use them. Show you a couple of use cases that are really easy one-liners. You may know some of them, maybe even all, I don't know. Then we're looking at custom attributes, what you can do if you would like to create your own attributes, and what you can basically do on top of the built-in attributes. And then there's a little bit boil up, a couple of solutions that use that. Let's see how far I can get in the time I have. Let's start by exploring attributes. And before I start, raise your hand, please, if you have created own attributes yourself. Anyone? That's going to be interesting discussions, what you did with them. All right. So what are attributes? Basically, when you look at a script code, no matter whether it's small or large, it's always the same kind of ingredients. It's like going to the bakery with all the pastries and stuff. They're all made of just a few ingredients. And PowerShell scripts typically use these ingredients. They are conveniently color-coded for us. Most of them are below the standards of this conference. There's just this one thing here, which looks a little bit like a type, but it is a text in brackets that has these. Do you say parentheses? Is this a parenthesis? Okay, good. So this is the only difference between a regular type and this thing is an attribute. So we all use them, obviously, in many of our scripts. This, for example, would declare this parameter as mandatory. And it's second nature. You simply use those and without thinking much. I would like now to dive a little bit deeper into these attributes. So I'm running this. Obviously, I'm getting asked for an ID. This is the magic built into PowerShell, so I'm submitting something. And now, if I wanted to see where these things ended up in my code, I can simply now pick this variable where both the type and the attribute was attached to. And then let's take a look at it. This is now my variable from inside PowerShell. It looks like this normally, but it has more properties. It has, for example, the property attributes. And when you look into this, you see two things. There are two attributes in there. So actually, this thing here is a lie. This is not a type. It's an attribute. It's just a special kind of unofficial attribute. This is clearly, you can clearly identify that this up here is an attribute. So they end up here. They do different things. The important part to take away is attributes you can glue to anything in PowerShell. You can glue them to variables, to functions, to any item in the language, but that wouldn't get you anywhere if there wasn't someone else who was picking up the attribute and do something with it. So if I declare a new attribute and I glue it to a variable, I can do that, but it doesn't get me any advantage. So we also need someone who is actually looking at these attributes. That is basically what I have done here. PowerShell is looking for a lot of these attributes. If you take a look at these types, these are the types of the attributes. And that is something you'll see in later on. This is just the attribute name, and the type that is defining this attribute has always a word attribute attached to it. So it's not parameter, but parameter attribute. This is basically what you see here. Here's the parameter attribute down here in the console. And you can even look up that type. It's a regular type, like this. There is. And this other type that you could see, this argument type converter attribute, that was this big lie behind types. When you add a type to a variable, PowerShell behind the scenes take this magic unofficial, non-public type conversion attribute, attaches it also to the variable, and that's why anything you assign to that variable is then converted to integer. Okay, now finding attributes. If you wanted to, I have a code in here that I'm not going to go through inside of this function. I'm simply using them as a tool. So I want to dump all the attributes that PowerShell brings. And if I do this, these are the attributes that you can use, all kinds of attributes. And that's probably the group of attributes you are most likely already using. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of use cases that use these predefined attributes, but before I go there, I want to show you what then the next steps can be. If you're not satisfied with the built-in attributes, you can simply create your own attributes, and that is not so hard. It's basically just this. I am taking a class. Who of you has used classes before in PowerShell? Okay, if you want to do a little bit more in attributes, you should know classes a little bit, but like you see, it's not so hard. This is the name of your new attribute, and the important part is that it needs to be derived from the system attribute. That's basically adding the functionality so that glues to everything. So here is a class. This is first, it's just a class. It has a property with a random number in there. It has a method that can do something. It takes the random number in this property and doubles it, or like multiplies it with itself. So what can I do with this attribute now? Basically the same stuff that you can do with built-in attributes as well. So I can attach it to anything. For example, I can attach this attribute to a variable, and when I do this, it works, PowerShell doesn't complain, I can still use the variable. However, I have no advantage because there's no one reading that attribute and doing something with it. However, you could. Let's take a look at what the reader, what that person that makes advantage or takes advantage of your attribute would have to do. Again, you would read that variable. You would again look at the attributes that are attached to this item. And you see now, this is my attribute. And this is already, if you really take a look at this, this is already an instance of that class. So whenever you take a attribute and you glue it to a variable, behind the scenes, PowerShell is making an object of that and attaches this instance of this specific object to the variable. So I now, if I was the receiver of this variable and were supposed to do something with my Tobias attribute, I would have to get my hold of it. So here I would read out the instance of my Tobias attribute. There it is. And now I can, it's basically now an object. I can read this information here. There's a random number in here. I can call the method on that type, on that object. Now the important part to understand is, basically this thing is simply adding a class definition to something, and then that something is initializing an object from it. And then someone needs to do something with it. When you take a look at the typical attributes, here for example, then there is something in these parentheses, mandatory or some kind of information. So where does that end up? Let's see. Here. This would be an example where I submit user information to an attribute. And that's basically what you always do when you use built-in attributes. You define parameters as mandatory or a validate set with the choices that the user can make. So in this case, where is this some info coming from? And as you have probably already guessed, when you take a look at the source code, there's not much source code. Any property you define in your class becomes a named argument for your attribute. So if you want the user to submit information to your attribute, for each item that you want the user to be able to submit, you add another property to it. If I do this here, so in this case, let's take this example. I am not taking the random number, instead I am taking the number 10. That's what I do. I get my instance from the variable. I look into that instance and there is the 10 in the property sum info, and obviously I can do things with that value. Okay, I'll go back to more practical code in a second. I'm just trying to sort of sort out how technically attributes really work. They are a class definition, they have input parameters, which are the properties. You can attach them to all kinds of things, and then that person or entity that is your attribute attached to needs to do something with it. Before I show you more use cases, here's another use case for custom attributes. Here is again my attribute, and sometimes you want to use attributes not during runtime, but just for reporting purposes. You want to decorate elements in your script so that you can automatically generate reports or identify those parts in your script. I just want to show you how that works real quick, and then we go back to a couple of one-liners. Here, for example, I added my own attribute to a parameter. If I would run the function test, nothing special would happen, because obviously PowerShell doesn't care about the Tobia's attribute. It's just my invention. So when I take this function, I can run it. It doesn't matter, I don't want to run it here. But if I was some kind of auto-reporting generator, I could take the source code of this function, either directly from the function like this. Here's the source code. It's not much source code in there. Here's the source code. Or you could actually read it from scripts. And then I could use the AST. That's another topic we can happily discuss in the lunch break session if you're interested in the abstract syntax tree. That's basically the PowerShell parser. So I could go ahead and take my code, look into my AST, and find all elements that are a parameter block. And then inside of the parameter blocks, I look at the attributes and look for my attribute that I attach to that parameter. And in the end, if I run this, let's do that. It would tell me exactly which parameter is decorated with which attribute. Okay, that's the theory. Now in practice, you will probably use lots of predefined attributes, and here's another script. They're numbered and you'll get them all, so you can follow my talk later on if you want to run those things. And, this is just another tool. When you open it, you again see the list of all predefined attributes that you can use. Many of them may sound familiar. So if I, for example, would pick parameter, now where is it? Like this thing here. How do I know? Now the list shows me what the names of those attributes are. Next thing I would like to find out is what are the things that I can submit to that attribute. We all know I can, for a parameter attribute, I can say mandatory, but what else could I do? And that's what you get here now. So when I choose that and click OK, then you get this list. And this is basically the list of named and positional parameters that you can sort of submit to this attribute. Here's mandatory, but you could also submit position, value from pipeline, and so on. This is one of the most popular attributes, so you'll all know these things and you'll probably use them. But now you have the tools to really look into many other attributes that are predefined. I'm running this again. Oh, wait a minute. This script. And so if you discover now here in this list any attribute that you don't know but that may sound interesting, you could simply pick it and just examine it and take a look at what it could do. Validate set, for example. Who's using validate set in scripts? Okay, did you know that did you know that validate set has a parameter ignore case? Well, I didn't. So if you have a validate set, I'll show you validate set in a second. Validate set basically is for string types, and you can say, I don't accept any string, I just want these strings to be in a variable. Then you can, now you know, you could also use ignore case if casing was important for you. Now let's take a look at the practical side. So this is theory, practical side, use cases. Now I'm not sure if I can show them all to you. As you can see, these are the attribute names. I have prepared a couple of examples and you get them all, so you can take a look at it in more detail if you like. Okay, there they are. This is the boring example from the beginning. this is something I want to mention to you because it doesn't work. The rest works, but this one doesn't work. As you can see, here I'm using two predefined attributes, supports wildcard and PS default value, that were originally in PowerShell supposed to help you define or decorate parameters that accept wildcards, so that that information would end up in help, that users could discover that a parameter is using a wildcard. Unfortunately, while these attributes are still there, the help doesn't pick them up anymore. So forget this, but all the rest works. And here you see how invalidate set ignore case works. So if you wanted to, for example, have a parameter that is a string type, basically, but you would only allow a couple of choices, and you require them to be case sensitive, then you could add that named parameter, and this here is positional parameter, because it doesn't have a name, obviously. So now try this. Connect server. Connect server. We now get this IntelliSense list. Now we have, like, PowerShell knows what to expect. I can choose something that works. If, however, casing wouldn't be correct, it'll fail. And if it is something different, it will fail, of course, too. Here, in this case, I attached an attribute to this parameter, and PowerShell, on the other end, honored it. So that was the sender-receiver principle. Here is a little puzzle for you. Here's my function. Take a look at it, what it does. It's a function, takes a parameter, it uses the pipeline, and so this is like the loop. And now I'm running this, and I'm getting an error. Why? Anyone has an idea why? Yeah, here's a null value in here, and an important fact is once you declare a parameter as mandatory, you also declare it, by declaring it mandatory, it cannot accept null anymore. If it was optional, it would work. So if I take out mandatory, this thing would work, but I don't. Instead, you have all these additional attributes that you can use, for example, allow null. This, again, sender receiver. You attach it to something, and PowerShell on the other end now knows, okay, for him it's okay to accept null, so then it'll work. Now everything is fine. So it's these little things of communicating that you can do with attributes. Here's another one. And this one is interesting because you can use it at two places. Alias. You can attach it to a parameter, which is awesome if you later on in the game decide to rename a parameter, but you would like your code to be still compatible. Then you can simply declare aliases, and then the new parameter name may be count, but it would still go under the names ID, numbers, and whatever. And the same attribute you can also apply to a function. So without having to define aliases externally, when you run this function, it also makes itself known as do it, oh man, and run, which means you can do both flavors of language. Again, just an attribute. Okay, so, no, wait a minute, this one is interesting. Who has used this attribute before? Fewer hands. I'm really relaxed that not with every question I ask, all hands go up. So this is interesting too. It actually wasn't meant to be used by you. It was introduced by DSC and classes, by the class implementation that Bruce Paget coded into PowerShell, because that is how they removed a couple of IntelliSense options when you deal with classes. But you can use it too. So if I declare a parameter with don't show, two things happen. Not just one, so I'll show you what happens. Take this, run it, connect server. As you can see, two things have happened. First, PowerShell has hidden one parameter, the one that I declared, plus it removed all common parameters, which can be useful in itself. Maybe you want to create a function, it should be an advanced function, but you don't want to bother the user with all the common parameters like error action, verbose, debug and stuff. So how can you get rid of them? This would be one way. You can simply define one parameter as don't show, even if you don't know, even if you don't need that parameter anymore. The other one, the parameter that is declared with don't show, is still there. It's simply not showing. However, if you press tab long enough, I think at one point it worked. Did I even? No. Let's just type it in. Secret override. There it is. Okay, you have to give them the first letter, but then it picks it up. Okay. Then, let me see, 7, 8, debugger. This is especially interesting. Again, I would like to know, is any one of you using one of these attributes up here? Okay. If you want to create code, especially if you create code that is in modules and hand it over to other people, team members or whoever, you may want to make sure that they don't step through your code when they debug their scripts. Let's assume you're writing a function, you have exported it to a module, and then someone else is using your function and is at some point setting a breakpoint in his own code, and he just wants to debug his own code. PowerShell typically would follow the code all the way, and you would see how eventually your code would also be visible, become visible, and would be stepped. By adding this to a function, you make sure that the PowerShell debugger knows that this is off limits. I can show you how that works by simply, I can use wait debugger, or I can, let's take wait debugger. So I'm running this function now. So now I am in the debugger right here, and when I press if F11 now, step into, without this attribute, I would now step into this code. Now I'm pressing F11, and it's not. So that is pretty nice to make sure your code isn't touched. All right. And then you may ask yourself, what's the difference between this attribute and the other ones? And basically, these attributes do not come from PowerShell. The PowerShell team simply decided to also honor them. They are typically used in C# code. So PowerShell is using this, and PowerShell is treating the other two the same. So it doesn't matter which one of the other two you use. The difference basically is, if you set a breakpoint in your function, and you want PowerShell to hit that breakpoint, then you need to use either one of these. So if you want to actually still be able to debug your own code. If you use this one, then PowerShell would not even honor breakpoints in this code anymore. Okay, now where else can we go? Let me see, not talking about, no, this was not the right one. Let's take 9. All right. Now, this is going to be interesting if you would like to increase the usability of your functions. Who has used argument completer classes? A couple of them, okay, a packet of you, that's good. They are quite complex if you want to use them to the fullest extent. Just for the others in this room, how does that work? Initially, you have seen validate set. Validate set was some kind of completer. You had a couple of string choices, and then when the user didn't type anything in, the editor popped up the IntelliSense menu. With argument completers, you can do dynamic lists, so you can calculate during runtime what you would like to show. For example, the servers that are up right now, or the menu of whatever, you can calculate that. Here's a piece of script code that is executed whenever this parameter expects input. So what I'm doing here is I'm defining today, yesterday, and last week. This one would get me error events from my event log. So the user would always see 3 dates, just relative to today. And when you want to show items in the completion list, you need to wrap them in this way. So each item, as you can see in a minute, in this completion list will be one of these objects. Let's just run it first, and then we can discuss how that works. And sorry for using get event log. I know that doesn't work any longer in PowerShell 7. Do get win event. Get error event. Let's try this. Get error event minus after. And now there is no static list anymore. Instead, it shows me these 3 items today, yesterday, last week, and obviously today is different today than in next week. When I use it though, look what happens now. I use today. It inserts the current date. Let's take again the code. How does that work? These are the 3 entries in my list. They always take these arguments. And as you can see, what the user sees in the list today, yesterday, last week is different can be different from what it inserts. And this is basically the tooltip. Important thing is this parameter. If you want this list to pop out automatically without the user having to press Control space, make sure you use parameter value in this third parameter here, which is the icon in this list. If you choose something else, and you can simply type in anything you want, and then you'll get an exception which lists the available options you have, then the IntelliSense menu wouldn't pop up automatically. Okay. All right, got this. 11. Now, if you want to really enhance usability of your functions, here is an example with the full-blown version of the Autocomplete attribute. As you can see, here's another parameter line in here, because whenever PowerShell runs your script block, it also submits all the information it has at this point. So with this, you know all the other parameters the user may have already typed in after the command. You can find out what the user already typed, and this way limit the list. So if you take a look at this source code when you download it, that is probably pretty self-explaining. I'm running it once for you so you know what it is doing. Oh, this is with getEvent event, so it will work in PowerShell 7 as well. Let's try it. Get event log entry. Get event log entry, log name, and this is what it created. It created a list of my available event logs that I have, and I'm using getEvent event, which is much better than using getEvent log. So now I can also touch the application logs. It gives me a little preview of how many events can I expect in this event log, and then I can simply pick one of those. Okay, that was a long one, and it runs. And now the other thing that this full-blown example will do is when the user is simply typing fractions of what to expect, micro, for example, and now I press Control-Shift, it'll pick up what I've already typed and limit the list to only what matches. So this is only the event log entries that start with micro. We can't, in the shortness of time, discuss all the details of the code, but I guess you are well capable of, when you have this example, to adjust it, even if you haven't done much with argument completer. The important point is, this is your script block. Make sure at the end you tell PowerShell what your options should be in that list, and how you get there from the information at the beginning to the list of auto-completion items is up to you. How much or how few things you will do. You do have access to the already typed in words. You have access to the parameters that are already entered after the command. That's this strange thing, fake bound parameters. That's basically your bound parameters. That's a hash table with all the parameters that the user has already used in this specific call. All right, so now let's see. Let's go to custom attributes. I've already shown you a little bit how you principally create your own attributes, the Tobia's attribute, but that was quite useless because there was no one who was actually reading that. So now we change that. You know those groups of attributes that validate input. We have validate null, validate not null, validate script, validate set, whatever. They are predefined. They do a validation on a variable. And when you derive your own attribute from validate arguments attribute, then you can create your own validators. I would like to, for example, it's not necessary. You can always get away with a validate script, because validate script is the most generic validator. It takes a PowerShell script of your choice and then determines whether an assignment is valid or not. But if you would like to reuse that, let's just for the fun of it take a validate argument attribute and as the source and create our own validate path exists. Now let's take a look at how this new type looks inside. Let's see. It's really simple. Most of it is comment. Take a look. This is the basic template for any validation attribute. And this is an interesting attribute because it is an attribute that PowerShell actively looks for. So once you derive from this thing, PowerShell does the rest for you. All you need to do is implement this function. This is always the same. And this is what you decide. So you receive anything, I called it path, but that's what someone is going to try to assign to a variable. And then you can decide whether it's okay or not. So in my case, I'm simply looking for the content of this variable. That's what the user is trying to assign to a variable. Is it something? And if it is something, does it exist? Is it a file? And when you don't think it fits, you just simply throw an exception. Let's try that. Here you see how that works. Again, those validate attributes work with variables, so they're not limited to functions and parameters. You can use them and decorate any variable with them for increased security, because from that point on, this variable is not only limited to strings, but in access, it's also only accepting strings of files that exist. Let's try that. Okay, now I have my variable path, and when I assign something new to it, C, ABCD, that should work. Oh, wait a minute. C, ABCD. But if I assign something that doesn't exist, I get my custom error message. So my attribute is actually completely attached to that variable. It's in there, and PowerShell picks it up because it is of the right kind and checks and validates the assignment. If you are creative enough, you can use that for all kinds of cool things, because your code in this validation attribute triggers whenever someone anywhere in your script assigns something to a variable. So you can create your own variable loggers or debuggers or whatever flow analyzers, whatever you want to. Here, for example, I'm not running this much. It is basically abusing the validate functionality because I don't want to validate anything. All I want to do is, I'm just highlighting the important things here. I want to know where am I in my script, which line, which column, what is happening there, and then I want to write that information to some global variable. So when the script ran, I know exactly how often did which variable receive which. All I need to do, obviously, is though, I need to make sure that my variables are assigned this attribute. Let's try this one. Would look like this. Here's my script. This would be my attribute. I would define on top of my script what are the variables that I would like to monitor. And now I'm running this. It's beeping a little bit. And this is the result from my attribute. It's simply telling me in which line, in which script, was which value assigned to a certain variable. Okay, so validators are really interesting in PowerShell. And let me just show one more thing because I'm running a little bit out of time, but fortunately I have all these. I thought I'd rather bring more examples than less. A transformation attribute would be the second interesting field where you can play. A validator only is triggered when someone is assigning a value to a variable, but it cannot change anything. If you have a transformation attribute, you have even more options because you can take the user input and then you can, if you want to, you can change it to some other type, so it's your own type converter. Actually, what you see in a moment is the technique behind basically this. This is commonplace, we use this all the time. You attach a type to a variable, and then magically, when you assign something new to it, it'll still be an integer. So here in the background, there is a transformation attribute that is transforming the user input to whatever you want really in that variable. However, here you have no way of controlling how the transformation works, and sometimes it just doesn't work. And if you want to change that, you can simply use the transformation attribute. I'm quickly showing you the general design. Yeah. This, for example, is a transformation attribute. It's as simple as that. That's a secure string transformation attribute. Very useful. You can attach it to a variable, and then anything someone assigns to that variable, if that is a secure string, it's okay. If it's a string, it'll be converted into a secure string. And if it's neither a secure string nor a string, then I get a hiccup. So why is that interesting? Because, wait a minute, I was here for, here's a use case. This could be a variable, it could also be a parameter. I would now be able, although the variable in the end is a secure string, I would still be able to also assign a regular text to it. Just imagine you have a function and you have a parameter that is a secure string. Then a user could never really assign a string to that parameter. It would always have to run through convert to secure string, which is intentionally what Microsoft really wants you to do. But now you can convert any type into any other type simply by using this as a template. Change the name to something you like better, and here add the logic to go from the initial type to the new type. Now let's take a look at an interesting use case for that you may want to use. It's here. Now I've just taken all the ties and pulled them together. So here are two classes. An autocompleter class, I'm just closing that one, and there should be another one, custom completer. Wait a minute, is that the good example? Custom completer, no, wait a minute, I'll take the boiler. Custom attributes, yep, that's it, sorry. That's the culprits of live coding. Do it again. Right, so here are my two custom attributes. They are the same principles. You can see this is a validator that I abused a little bit. It's an auto-learn attribute. And we have an argument completer that I created and adjusted a little bit. Let's take a look at what they can do. Let's say you are creating functions for your colleagues or customers. Connect my server, for example. Then you cannot use a validate set. If you give that away to another company, to another colleague, then the servers are not the same. You don't know which IPs or usernames or credentials they use. So are you now not able to create a good user interface? No, you can do this. The only thing that I changed from what you typically do is I applied these two new attributes to my parameters. And they work like this. This attribute learns anything a user assigns to that parameter, puts it in a list, in a static list, and this one auto-completes. And this thing here is simply for your convenience, so you can decide which list, that's basically the list name. So obviously I don't want this parameter and this parameter to auto-complete the same things. That's why I call this user. I could call it Max or Tobias, as long as it's different from this one. So let's try this. Connect my server. Initially it's dumb, so it can't really give me any clue. Same thing here. Next time can be tomorrow because it's static. This thing has learned. So now there's Tobias. And now there is server 12. Now I say this is 127.0.0.1. Okay, next day it learned again. So that is the idea behind here. You can do a customer-oriented sort of auto-learning, auto-completion. Yeah, where's it? A very good question. Thanks for the bridge that you built for me. Currently, in that implementation, I simply used a text file. You can store it anywhere. If you take a look at the custom attributes, you'll see where I store it. And if you would like to store it in a database or in an encrypted file, you can do that. So here, if I run this, you'll see where my hints were stored. There they are. So these were the things for the one parameter, and this was what I have saved for the other parameter. So there is really, it's a Pandora's box. Once you open it, if you have a little bit passion with attributes, you can do a lot of things. One last thing, because I'm definitely running out of time here, sorry, but then I want to show you where you get the code. Initially, I said, yes, you can attach attributes to things like variables and then have PowerShell do magic things with them. But I also said you can be declarative. And I just want to show you one example where that comes into play. Who of you has ever used dynamic parameters? Okay, was that, how was the experience when you? Horrible, right? Yeah, because PowerShell supports dynamic parameters, but it doesn't support them in the normal way. You have to be really low-level coding. Wouldn't it be nice if we would simply have an attribute like this, dynamic? So if I add dynamic to a parameter, I really want that this parameter will not show every time, but only if this evaluates to true. So I want to have it show lunch only in the morning or after 11 o'clock, and I want maybe to even take relations to other parameters. If the path that the person entered starts with A to Z, then show mount. Something like that. Wouldn't it be nice to have that? Now the sender-receiver principle says, yes, you can create an attribute dynamic, that's easy, but you need someone else who's picking that up and then actually creating that dynamic parameter, and that can only be PowerShell. I have no control over PowerShell, however, here's the scoop. Let's close that real quick. And then you can create this dynamic code yourself very easily. Oh, wait. Okay. Now, here is a function that I would like to convert to, wait a minute, that was the function. Here's a function that I would like to convert. Here are a couple of those dynamic attributes. This is how you can then auto-generate the code. You're simply taking that code, this code, and sending it. This is sort of my parameter block that I declared with my dynamic attributes. And since PowerShell doesn't understand that, I sort of stepped in with this function get dynamic parameter definition. I take my script block with this declaration, tell him how my function should be called, and when I run this, the source code is in the clipboard. Now when I look into my clipboard, the result should look like this. So this is in my clipboard. When I run this function now, I have a function that is called, wait a minute, start test. And you can see now, start test, it has, here is a dynamic parameter. If it was before 11, we would see breakfast here. And then we have, just remember the parameters you see, action path lunch, that's it basically, action path lunch. When I choose an action, let's say action edit, then magically new parameters come up, ID, customer name, and so on. So that is something, if you want to, you can, it's still the same ugly code in here, but you don't have to write it yourself. So that was the idea. If you want to, until I get PowerShell to implement it. If you want to get your hands on the code, there are two ways of how you can do this. Either go to the GitHub for the conference, or if you would like to just read it a little bit, my blog is on PowerShell 1. And what you have seen here can be found under fundamentals, attributes, and then basically the examples are explained in great detail here. Okay. With all the, the entire code is right here. Okay, now I know Torsten is already smiling because I said speakers, 30 minutes, that's all you have, and I kind of got out of hand. Do you have any questions at this point? Here's a microphone. And I promise I won't steal the coffee break from you. So after 1-2 questions, we'll open up the doors. You can leave for coffee if you want to, or you can stay in here for more questions.
Could you put up the class that you wrote, the first one? Mm-hmm. After the name, there's a colon.
Okay, help me a little bit. Is it in which part of it? In the beginning or?
Just the very first you
oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Let's just open them all. Let's see. This one?
Yeah, you have a colon, a system.attribute. I've mucked about a little bit with classes, but I've never used this colon and certainly not anything after. Could you expand a bit?
Yes, of course. Basically, that's a nice thing about classes. It's more software development. So if you have a class without this, then it would be purely your class. So you would have to define all the properties yourself. If you derive your class with this colon from some other class that already exists, it inherits everything the other class already has. So when I do this, let's take a look at it. I define it. Now I have a type, Tobias attribute. There it is. Oh no, it's not there. See, what did I do wrong? Tobias attribute should be there. There it is. And then I can create an object from it. And this doesn't appear anymore. Instead, I see now get custom attribute, get custom attributes. I haven't defined them anywhere. That's because I derived that from system attribute. Does that explain it a little bit? It's like a family tree. You can define a person, and then when you have another class that's a consultant, that can be derived from person. And then it adds the normal things. Another question. And again, I don't feel insulted if you go out and get coffee, because it's your coffee break.
Can we clap first?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Here was another question.
Is there any way to reuse the data that was given to an attribute? Like if I use validate set, can I use the set that was entered into validate set in the code somewhere?
The last part again, can I do what with?
Can I use the set that was entered in validate set in the code somewhere?
Can you find out basically what was in there?
Yes.
When you have validate set, it wouldn't make too much sense since you hard-coded it in there and can never change. But if you derive from validate set to create some own magic, then the attribute is still attached to your parameter. It's a variable. So you can ask, you would do it like this. Basically, let's... No, wait a minute. You just try and find it real quick. Use cases, no, it's in here. Okay, basically, let's assume you have added your validate set to the parameter ABC. Then in your function code, you do get variable ABC. Then you get that variable, and then you ask attributes, and then it's right there. Okay, more questions?
Is there a pull request already for the dynamic attributes?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're very well. There is a link actually.
And can we upvote it?
I'll show you. When you go to GitHub, to my GitHub, which is Tobias PSP, unfortunately in the module there's a wrong link. So when you go to my GitHub, then you go to dinparam. Oh no, dinpara, that's it. No, shit, I need to search for it. Wait a minute. Repositories. Modules dinpar, okay. So that's basically where the code lives. If you just want to download the code, go to the gallery and look for dinpar. So PowerShell gallery, and then Dunpar. There it is.
Tobias, the question was more about to encourage you to make this as pure touch and PowerShell so that we have it in language like built-in instead of having as.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, actually, I'm in the commanded working group, so I'm actually sitting there with Microsoft deciding about feature requests. However, it's not a commanded thing, it's an engine thing, so I need to find people sitting in the engine working group. We discussed it up and down, but we weren't able to decide on that. I would love to see that, but you know, the main feedback we got for this dynamic attribute was that Microsoft said no one needs that. I think I would need it.
I saw Sydney. Maybe you can neck her.
Yes, I'll show Sydney. Maybe you...
We have a request.
Any more questions?
I know that it's called dynamic, but it feels like it's more like a conditional parameter. Am I right?
Well, I'm using the condition to dynamically define that parameter. So actually, when you look at that code that results, this was the result code. This thing is inside PowerShell, dynamic parameter, you can use it, it's a part of the language, and this code is dynamically executed, and of course there is a condition in there. So you can use both. You have conditions that dynamically create parameters.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
There's Thorsten back there.
you.
For the autolearn attribute, is there any way for the user to delete learned values?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
For the autolearn attribute, is there any way for the users to delete the values that the
Yes. The question was, is there any way for the auto-learning attribute to reset the list?
Yeah.
In the example I showed, there was no way because I was using a validation attribute and that cannot change anything. But when you go on that web page, I'll show you where. PowerShell.1 was my blog, like I said, then fundamentals, and then you simply go down here to custom attributes. Custom attributes, and it's all explained in here. There's a second example that's using a transformation attribute, and then you can simply, in this example, the user just adds a minus, and that means I want to clear the entire list and start over again. But you can implement any technique you want to delete it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, thanks so much. See you in the next session. Well, in the audience.